All right, good afternoon, everybody, or good afternoon to most of you. Good day to the rest of you. I'm Seth Litwin from the ILR School at Cornell, and I'm chairing this session called Worker Power in Platform Ecosystems. We all know that the labor markets that most of us sort of learned about canonically aren't necessarily the ones that we need to be understanding right now. There are lots of changes, even in sort of the fundamental parties to the employment relationship. And that is what this session is focusing on. And what's really cool, and is sort of an extra treat, is that all three papers and all four presenters across those three papers are junior faculty at some of the best schools in our field. And so what's really exciting is you're definitely looking at the future. It's here, the future is now, both in terms of what they're studying and in terms of who's studying it and who's going to be talking to you today. Our first presenter is going to be Jenna Myers. She's an assistant professor at the University of Toronto at their Center for Industrial and Human Relations. She has her PhD from MIT. Mike Maffey is here as well. He's here from Penn State. He's in their labor studies department. And he did his PhD right here at the ILR school. And then finally, we've got Duanyi Yang and Tingting Zhang. They'll be presenting as well, and I think both of them will be sort of taking part in that third paper. Tingting went to U of T, and Duanyi went to MIT, and now Duanyi is a colleague of mine, and Tingting is at the University of Illinois. So all in all, we've got some awesome people and some awesome topics, and our plan is basically to have each of them talk for about 12 minutes. And then we're going to sort of banter amongst ourselves and kind of ask each other questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you. And ideally, we'll have time to do all of that if I do my job reasonably well. Does that seem like a plan? All right. So we're going to start then with Jenna Myers from the University of Toronto, Platform Brokerage for the representative powered groups during technology development. Welcome, Jenna.
Thank you, Adam. And please do interrupt me if for any reason you can't hear me, if my internet cuts out. I'm visiting family right now, so it's a little bit less reliable than usual, but we'll see what we can do here. So very happy to be kicking off this session. I'm going to be sharing, can you see the proper screen, by the way, Adam? Just give me a nod. Yeah, okay. I'm going to be sharing data from a broader ethnography of the use and development of a manufacturing software platform, but focusing today on development. And I want to start with the debate around the effect of advanced technologies' effects on jobs. And thankfully, that has kind of moved to be less about robots and technologies taking jobs wholesale, but instead on robots and new technologies affecting job quality. And so we probably all know of many examples of technologies that don't totally automate work, but affect it in new and often negative ways. And that's important. If workers are working more with these technologies that have potentially negative effects on their jobs, there's an even stronger argument now for that those workers should have some say in how those technologies are developed. And I think in Michael's presentation, we're going to hear a little bit around how the nature of platform design really matters for the quality of jobs that rely on those platforms. But as many know here, it's difficult for workers' perspectives to be meaningfully included in development due to their low structural power. But I want to raise, unfortunately, yet another difficulty. Many advanced technologies, and I'm going to be talking about platforms as a service here, they're used by multiple user groups, such as managers and workers within organizations. And both of these groups can have legitimate interests and ideas to further platform development. So imagine workers and managers both using an electronic monitoring platform that's managed by a third-party vendor. So workers might have valuable input on features of the scanning technology or how it should be used in the workplace to gather relevant data. Well, a manager might have valuable input on how the data coming from that platform should be analyzed or displayed. So when it gets tricky is when that input is in disagreement. So really the starting off point for this paper is that even if workers are included in technology development, platform developers must handle these competing claims from different user groups and manage these power differentials that exist across them. So that kind of launches off the research question for this paper, which is how do platform developers navigate these disagreements that arise from the competing claims of users? And there's many reasons we'd want to see developers navigate these competing claims and strike a balance. And one I'm going to emphasize is that they need to achieve ongoing legitimacy and acceptance from their high power users. but also we'd like to see them elevate their low power users. So that's a little bit of a nuance to the question here. For sake of time, I'm not going to go over theoretical background here. There's several literatures that I draw on, including the social construction of technology, user-centered design literatures, and these have underlined the importance of including low power users in technology development like workers, but they've not explained the practices by which developers can do so while still balancing the inclusion and satisfaction of these higher power users like managers. So again, the data here comes from an ethnography of technology development under that developed and managed a digital manufacturing monitoring platform. And this technology had two user groups: lower power machine operators who were responsible for entering in data at the machine on these tablets that you can see in the picture, and then higher power managers and engineers who were originally constructed to be the key user group of this platform and who would analyze the data coming off of the platform with a web application. And you can kind of see a screenshot of that application here. So developers in this setting had procedures for gathering and incorporating user feedback for technology development. And in my analysis, I identified a number of different development disagreements that occurred as they gathered this feedback and considered how to improve particular technology features. And I found two different sources of conflict broadly that developers encountered that kind of underpinned these different disagreements. So first, role conflict here is disagreements that were stemming from different ideas and pieces of feedback that occurred between managers and machine operators who, of course, each had different interests, frames, and interpretations about the technology. And developers had to integrate feedback across these different roles. Next was also context conflict, which is what I call disagreements that stemmed from differences between members of the same role. So imagine managers here using the platform across many different types of organizations. So a small machine shop to a much larger multinational enterprise, for instance, or managers who are using the platform at organizations with many very different types of cultures, and some which might be more progressive in their policies towards workers than others. So developers also had to develop features that were appropriate for these varied contexts. And what I found was that to balance different interests of users and to also work towards the goal of elevating machine operators' interests, which I can talk later about why they wanted to do that in the first place. When developers were resolving these disagreements, they used this set of what I'm calling brokerage practices that fell into a specific pattern here. And I'll just go over a couple of those practices as examples. So first, to manage the role conflict that occurred during these disagreements, again, conflict among managers and machine operators in the feedback that they gave, developers used these role brokerage practices, which allowed them to construct shared interests across user roles and elevate these low power users. So one example is a practice I call stretching roles, which is where developers brainstormed realistic possibilities for enriching the operator's work tasks and relations amidst the constraints of managerial control. So one example here was that managers and machine operators disagreed in their feedback about how much and what type of data should be available on the worker-facing tablets. And developers used this feedback to frame a new notifications feature as useful to both workers and managers while elevating the amount of information and control that workers had on their tablets. So internally, a developer was saying, the problem is we're not communicating any feedback whatsoever to operators as to how the data displayed on the tablet works. This could be such a big tool. It could drive notifications. Operators could say, look at the average cycle time for this job. It's way off. And then they could send a note to managers. Can you please change these standards? There's all kinds of power there. So there's all sorts of technical details behind this example, but basically developers are aiming to elevate workers' control over sending notifications to managers and to construct this as a shared interest that allows workers to notify managers more quickly when production cycles were off. So of course, there's limits to this. In some cases, managers would push back on sharing too much control with workers, and developers had to kind of manage that level of feedback as well. But next general category here is to manage context conflict that occurred, which again was across managers in different types of organizations. Developers engaged in these context brokerage practices, which allowed them to buffer differences across contexts. And this was especially useful when they encountered managers that, for whatever reason, didn't want different features to be developed that would expand workers' control or their access to data, or managers who simply didn't think that focusing on improving the worker-facing features was an important priority. So one example of this practice is emphasizing personalization, where developers created customizable or optional features in response to pushback from managers. So the example here is that there was a disagreement that occurred with the color of workers' tablets. And the color, the way the tablet was backlit, was used to signify the machine's progress towards its production goal. So the original design of the tablet was very much in workers' face. They would see bright tablets if their machine was behind on the production goal, even if it was due to no fault of their own. And so this was very demotivating, they told the vendor. So managers at some organizations agreed with the workers that the tablet was too aggressively backlit, it was affecting motivation. But managers at other organizations wanted to maintain this existing very aggressive design because they wanted to view their tablets at a distance across the factory floor. So in response, developers did design a new version that kind of pulled away from this aggressive color. And they were talking about this additional feedback that they received. And the developer says, I've been hearing from managers, where's the full screen color? We want full screen color back. But we made a very conscious decision to get away from that. Other developer and I talked about it philosophically. We got rid of this for a reason. We're not giving it back to you. If we were to return to something like that, in general, I like giving them options. For instance, here's maybe a more pronounced design to view it from far away, or we can also look into how we might make this little status wheel itself more pronounced. So the developer's saying they changed the design. They're not going to bring it back as an option for anyone, but they're acknowledging that there was some feedback and they wanted to design some additional options that wouldn't be available as the default, but would be there for managers who pushed back on the new design. So a lot of practices, obviously, that I'm skipping over here, but just to summarize, I've kind of described this strategy that accounts for how developers manage disagreements both across managers and operators, and then kind of among managers. So using these connecting practices, this allowed developers to construct shared interests across high and low powered alters, so the workers and the managers, in service of pursuing an acceptable technology design while still representing low powered users' interests. And then using these buffering practices allowed developers to appease these higher powered managers who disagreed with the goal of elevating the low powered group. So just to quickly review those contributions, the literature on algorithmic control has shown that technologies can act at a distance to have these negative effects on workers. And this newer literature has paid a lot of attention to the particular technical characteristics and how those respond, but paid less attention to the actual developers behind these algorithms. So I'm showing here how platform developers can influence power asymmetries, for instance, by addressing the requests of these low-powered users for additional data or for different digital interfaces, and by resisting some requests from high-powered users that could reinforce this differential. And this older literature, the social construction of technology, some literature on user-centered and participatory design, it's shown that developers can and should use practices to include multiple stakeholders in technology development. But I'm adding some nuance here and showing that these conflicts exist and might arise when users of different power have legitimate but competing claims and interests, which can often occur on these platform ecosystems. And I'm showing how developers can use these brokerage practices to resolve disagreements in ways that maintain satisfaction from high-powered users while still elevating the feedback from lower-powered users. So to summarize, in these advanced technologies like platforms as a service, we often see them being used by multiple user groups, such as workers and managers. So you can think also of applicant tracking platforms used in the HR context, and different user groups that use these platforms have different types and relative amounts of power, which can also often lead to negative outcomes for the low-powered group. But there's normative and strategic reasons for developers to want to include both worker and manager feedback in technology development. But there's at least two issues in doing that. Issue number one is just motivating the developers to include workers in development in the first place. But I'm arguing here that there's this second issue once they decide to do so, that balancing worker and manager interests during technology development is difficult while still maintaining legitimacy and user acceptance. So to begin to solve this second issue and deal with the conflicts that are, showing here that platform developers can act as brokers to connect interests across these different power differentials and buffer the impact of some antagonistic users. And so that's where I'm going to end. In the Q&A, we can talk, if people are interested, about the implications for the gig economy, because that's a very, very different type of platform ecosystem that we're going to be hearing about in the next presentation, I think. So thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jenna. And thank you for that great segue as well. We all decided that we're going to take questions at the end, so I hope that's okay with folks. Let's move on to Mike Maffey from Penn State. His paper is Moonlighting in the Gig Economy, New Forms of Worker Power. Welcome, Mike.
All right. Thank you, everybody. All right, so my presentation is on moonlighting in the gig economy. And we know that lots of workers moonlight. There's lots of different terms for it: moonlighting, pluri-activity, dual job holding. They all refer to the increase of workers using a second job to supplement their primary income. Now, there's lots of challenges to measuring this because people frequently turn over in their second job, which makes it difficult to know exactly how large of a phenomenon this is. But empirical research shows that about 6% of people at any given time are in some sort of a second job capability. But we know that over time that this is a much larger phenomenon. So McKinsey in their 2017 survey of both the US and Europe found that about 1 in 3 people earn income outside of their primary job during some time during the year. And there's lots of motivations for the reasons why people engage in moonlighting. Under seasonal employment, such as teachers who moonlight during the summer sessions, or police officers often moonlight as private security guards. Some people do it for skill diversification in order to try to improve their abilities, such as in the high technology field. Often people will moonlight to learn a different coding language. A career bridge for those who are looking to enter a completely different field can sometimes moonlight in a different occupation, or to fund an entrepreneurial venture, or people who are looking to strike out on their own but aren't earning enough income from their primary income source in order to fund that venture. Now, within the academic literature, there's reasonable evidence that working a secondary job affects individuals' relationship with their primary job. Sort of a theoretical tension between what's called the energetic opportunity hypothesis and the deprivation constraint hypothesis, which one claims that working a second job allows people to explore things that interest them. It allows them to engage in a separate skill set. And so this opportunity allows them to perform better in their primary job. Now, the deprivation.
Can I just interrupt you for a moment? We just wanted to make sure, you're not sharing slides, right?
I should have been sharing slides.
Okay, thank Duan Yi, because I was like, I don't want to interrupt him.
No,
she was like, maybe you should. Sorry, go ahead.
You would think that whatever year we're at in the pandemic, that.
No, I just thought you were like I thought you were like one of those super innovative people that was too cool for slides.
No. Where is this? For some reason, Zoom is not.
Do we have to make you a host or something?
No, it's saying that for some reason, this is apologies. It says that I have to allow Zoom to share slides. Oh,
Michael, I can try to bring up your slides real quick if that's not working, and I can do it. Oh no, there you go.
There you go.
There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, apologies. So there's reasonable evidence that that this affects people's primary job. And the deprivation constraint hypothesis is merely that as you work a second job, it deprives you of resources, attention, and energy that trades off with your ability to perform well in your primary job. Now, the question that I'm looking at is the relationship between gig work and moonlighting. We know about 16% of people over the course of a year will work a gig. It's a new Pew study that came out last year. And similar to moonlighters, roughly 70% of gig workers use these as a secondary job. And we also know that gig workers have similar financial motivations, at least, to try to bridge under or unemployment to traditional moonlighters. But there are also important differences that we know between these two. Recent research finds that working on an online platform can hinder people's career development because it trades off with their ability to focus on a primary career. There are unpredictable wages, which make it difficult to use gig work as an income supplement, often because you can't control when there are high periods of customer demand. And you learn fewer transferable skills. So it makes it difficult to use this as a career bridge. but it also avoids a key element of tension, which is that there are incompatible shifts is the underlying justification for why the constraint hypothesis emerges, that people are forced to work two separate jobs, often at times which cause them the most sort of energy drain. So if you have to work a shift at one restaurant and then work another one immediately after that, but if you had the capability of spacing those out, it may break the link between moonlighting and sort of draining your energy that you have to give to your primary job. We know from early research that finds that platform work can improve people's performance at a primary job. But despite this, we know very little about how working a gig shapes the way that people relate to their primary job. So what is the spillover effect between working on a platform and working a more traditional job? So in order to address this question, I recruited 33 gig workers, 16 worked on Instacart, 13 worked on Uber, and 4 worked both. I wanted to have both a grocery delivery platform because it has become a more important part of the gig economy during the pandemic, and then sort of the more traditional research side of rideshare. It's a higher cost generally to operate in both. And then I used semi-structured interviews that lasted roughly 45 minutes in length. So first, I find that gig workers use these jobs as stopgaps in order to try to address other forms of precarious work. The primary way was calling in sick in order to work on a gig. So one of my respondents said in 2020, when the pandemic first came about, I would sometimes stay home from work to work on Instacart because I would make more money that way. So my mindset would be, I don't want to deal with these people all day, my coworkers, my boss. I know that I can make up the difference working for Instacart. So it's not like I'm missing a paycheck. I'd rather be by myself, in my peace of mind, doing my thing as opposed to being in the office. It was a stress reliever, and I didn't have to be there in the office, and I could make money on my own terms. Surprisingly, that was the first participant that had indicated that they had done that. As I continued to hold interviews, this became a common occurrence. For example, one person who's in their primary job, they have long periods of downtime in which they're not compensated, said, there have been a couple of days when I have to take time off from regular job, when it's like, yeah, I'll make a lot more money doing that than my regular job, so let me get some time off for that. And the immediacy of being able to cash out helps people bridge short-term costs. For example, this one participant said, because I needed cash ASAP, and I didn't want to go into my savings, so I know if I call out, I can make more money. I'll still get paid, but I need the cash up front. So I'll go hustle and bank was shipped. So I asked them, was there a reason why you did this? And they said, yes, they needed to pay rent. Others will double dip with paid time off. So they said, I have a vacation days to use or lose at the end of the year. So I took a few days off, just some paid time off. I drove for Lyft because I could. The second major, and this was very unexpected because of some of the research that I'll talk about in the discussion on algorithmic management, is that some workers use these breaks as a refuge from abusive management practices. So one full-time gig worker who actually left a high-paying job in order to work on Instacart said, bosses are stricter with low-paying job employees. They expect them to work every day, pretty much kill themselves. I'm pretty sure everyone is starting to shift the way they think about employment and how they make money. There's so many options out there. I'm over it. I'm not going to feel like I'm stuck anymore. Now that I know I've done it before, I can do it again. And this was a worker who had worked in a landscaping company that had a very poor relationship with a supervisor who would engage in various abusive management practices. And to them, the predictability of the platform was less whimsical than the manager that they were working for. Others felt it was less degrading to work on an app because the app-based work rules are clearer than those that were in their precarious work environment. So once I'm going back to the office and I have to work every day, whether I want to or not, I don't have seniority or not, I can't bail on any day. Just the thought of having to answer to someone, I can't do it. I don't want to. Well, another one said that their manager was always breathing down my neck all the time. Or yet another said that they worked on Instacart too because they didn't like getting in trouble for coming in 5 minutes late. There's none of that with rideshare. And finally, for full-time work platform workers, I asked them how this affected their job search in the future. Did it affect their future relationship with more traditional employment? And those who were successful at supporting themselves and felt like platform work was meeting their needs, it shaped what they were looking for for full-time jobs. For example, one platform worker said, a full-time job would have to be a lot more flexible. A lot of the times organizations will pay a salary or an hourly rate and will be like, okay, I work these hours and I get paid for these hours. But there would have to be a lot of flexibility, and pay would have to be better because there are heavy demands on your time to be at a specific place at a specific time. Now, there are important limitations to workers' ability to use gig work against their precarious, more traditional job. And the key one is the instability associated with this income. For example, I thought that one worker best summarized this as, one of the big drawbacks of gig work is that I put in hours and I make no money because it's not busy. I've got rent to pay, kids to support, so I need a certain amount of stability. Even with options, with the ability to leave a toxic job and do gig work for a while, we're still not quite there. We still don't feel quite secure enough with either gig work or a regular job to commit to something and say, yeah, this is my ticket. So I think that this is, I'm still in the initial phase, so I'm curious to hear folks' feedback on it, but I see this as there are competing types of precarity. Whereas in traditional jobs, you often can have more abusive management. You don't have control over your hours. You can get cut from a shift at a restaurant early. But the gig economic model can be used against these types of low wage or abusive employers, such as you can create gig related absences if you get scheduled for a shift where you're not going to make a lot of money. It appears, and what's somewhat interesting is that although their research in the algorithmic management area says that people often question the opacity and somewhat whimsical nature of algorithms if not explained, it can actually be what appears more predictable than some of the ways in which abusive managers may treat low-wage employees. And for those who have few or poor labor market options, it appears that they can use gig work as an extended unemployment insurance benefits. Now, it's important. What I think these point to is that it's important to understand gig work in its institutional context. These quote unquote benefits are only advantageous in a world in which the surrounding available work has largely become unpredictable and not meeting workers' everyday needs. And one way to think about this is to pose the counterfactual. Could gig work have emerged in previous industrial eras where people were able to largely support themselves, although of course there are important exceptions, but there were more stable and robust labor institutions that protected workers. But I think what this points to is that, and I'm guilty of this as well, many times we think about gig work as an island separated from other organizations, and we say this is a rideshare driver, or this is an MTurk worker, and we don't consider how it exists within a constellation of work that people may piece together and how they can use different models of work against each other for their own advantage. Now, it's important that there are limitations to using gig work, as I mentioned. There's unpredictable jobs. Platforms can hide and use abusive algorithms in order to try to deceive workers. And there can be unknown or hidden costs. And so it's important for future research to examine how workers consider these in relationship to how they can use platform work against more traditional work. But I think it sets up an interesting hypothesis that future research can test if improving labor conditions on gig work, such as when New York City implemented the minimum fare for rideshare drivers, pushed low-wage employers to do the same, or to try to improve their labor conditions as this alternative model of work improved or provided more stable compensation for workers. And if you have any comments, questions, complaints, or grievances, here's my contact information.
Wonderful. A way to keep time, even in the wake of the bump we hit. It frightens me to think that that the platform is actually more transparent than their human boss. Up next, and our final paper is from Duanyi Yang and Tingting Zhang. They're looking at voice without representation, particularly in China's network public sphere. And Duanyi is going to lead us off.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. I'll start over again.
No problem. Yes, definitely.
All right, thanks, Adam, and good afternoon, everyone. And it is a great pleasure to join this panel and share one of my new research with my colleague Tingting Zhang. And our research is motivated by the fact that in recent years, there has been a rise of alternative worker voice channels, and many of these initiatives are actually enabled by the development in information communication technology, such as our use of social media. So to give you an example, the Me Too movement on social media has raised our awareness of sexual harassment in workplaces. So workers' discussion on social media may have changed our organizational culture and how the companies handle the sexual harassment in the workplaces. But despite the growth of the alternative worker voice enabled by social media, we think that the IR research tradition has turned to confine its attention only to the formal structure of worker representation and the formal grievance procedures. We think that this gap of research is problematic because we know that labor unions have struggled to maintain its political and economic power in recent decades around the world. And in particular, this gap is problematic in a lot of the developing countries and in the authoritarian context, where we know that the traditional voice channels are either absent or highly underdeveloped. So therefore, in this study, we consider two primary research questions. So firstly, we ask whether social media can be a critical space for dissatisfied workers to address their grievances, to define and to discuss their workplace problems in authoritarian states. And secondly, we ask whether worker voice on social media can be transformed into offline activisms in authoritarian regimes. And we examined our two research questions by studying the worker protest against the long working time schedule in China's tech sector. And people usually refer the long schedule as 996, which means that you start work at 9 a.m. and you finish work at 9 p.m. and you work 6 days per week. So to give you some institutional context, so in 2019, the workers' grievances and workers' dissatisfaction over the overtime work culture sparkled a series of online protests when workers connected and when the tech workers exchanges information on GitHub, as well as some of the other social media platforms in China. And the anti-996 movement spurred a national debate about the overtime work culture in China and labor exploitation. And the state-run media, such as the People's Daily, also published a series of articles criticizing the 996 work culture, and the Supreme People's Court ruled such a work schedule illegal last summer. And we think that this is surprisingly globally, since we know that tech workers have not had much success anywhere in advancing their traditional labor claims. And it is particularly surprising in China, where we know that the state is committed to preventing political mobilization and political voice on the internet. So the anti-996 movement has raised a lot of critical questions for IR worker voice research. It is worthwhile to think about whether the fundamental driving processes, as well as the impact of social media-enabled worker voice, different or similar from traditional worker voice channels. So on one hand, we think that social media has a power to overcome a lot of the limitation of the traditional worker voice options. So first of all, worker voice on social media has advantages in the scale of influences, because the flexible and ever-extending boundary of the public network space could enable more people to see and to disseminate information, because social media could afford fast and easy communication almost for free. So the internet activism can scale up very quickly at a very low cost. And secondly, compared to the traditional worker voice options, the worker voice on social media can be more personalized and can also be more diverse. So in the case of the Me Too movement I just mentioned, so the social media discussion could empower many workers to share their traumatic experiences related to sexual harassment in the workplaces. And the worker could also provide validations and provide support to each other, and the marginalized voice, such as the Me Too for LGBTQ+ population, can be amplified on social media. But on the other hand, although social media platform clearly enabled disconnected workers to organize, but we think that worker voice on social media typically lacks concrete plans to develop the movement. And therefore, we think that social media communication was usually criticized to promote the so-called people called clickvism, which fails to foster a deep commitment among workers. And in authoritarian states, we think that this kind of short-lived flash activism may also be a result of manipulation, surveillance, and state censorship. So for example, in the case of China, the Chinese state exemplifies an authoritarian state's capacity of systematic information control. So the state may use sophisticated blocking systems to censor worker voice online. So social media users may not even realize the information censorship, so making it impossible to encounter. And now I will leave this to my co-author, Tingting, and Tingting will introduce our data as well as the findings.
Thanks, Dwayne. And in this particular research, we adopted what we call the sequential mixed method kind of like approach. In the first step, we tried the computational topic modeling. That's the main kind of like a presentation about today. And we also have kind of like decided to run the semi-structured interview. And those interviews are currently in the process. And the reason that we really want to kind of like put these two different approaches into the same project is because the computational topic modeling has been, even though it's been increasingly used in social science, but in the field of industrial relations, it hasn't been kind of like, operationalized. So for the kind of sake of making a methodology contribution, we also want to kind of like compare this two line of research method and figure out like, is there really kind of a space for computational methodology in our field? Next slide, please. And like I said, in this presentation, we're just gonna present the result of the topic modeling. And we use the pretty standard topic modeling algorithm called the latent dirichlet allocation, LDA. And later, we also plan to try different kind of like topic modeling methodology and algorithm to verify our finding as well. Next slide. Like we can come back to talk about the methodology if we have time. In terms of the data, we picked this social media kind of like a question and answer site called Zhihu.com. Okay, it's the largest question and answer website. If you are not familiar with the Chinese setting, like the comparable English website is Cornell or Reddit. Pretty much like, members can post a question and all the kind of like a registered community members, they can answer like, as they want. We scraped the public available data between January 1st and 2019 and June 30th, 2021. The kind of a key phrase we used to do the web scraping, including 996 and work overtime, because the majority of the discussion on that site is in Chinese. So we also scrape like the key handlers that related to overtime in Chinese as well. And we collect the data both in the questions and the comments. The website was constructed, it's different from like, things that folks are familiar with, such as Twitter, which has a kind of like a word limit that you only can post like 280 characters. In Zhihu, if you want to post something, you can write up to 100,000 words. So the data we collected is huge in terms of text content. Of course, the majority of the data has like a very brief kind of just a couple of sentences, but the bigger kind of like a really extensive comments and the questions that we could potentially have like 20,000 words in our data set. And after data cleaning, after verify all the questions, we were able to gather during those period more than 1,700 questions. And oh, I put the comma in the wrong place. More than 389,000 comments in that period. Next slide, please. So just give you a kind of like in terms of the timeline and the frequency of the discussion. You can see that here we have two different vertical kind of like axis. That's because it's a question and answer, right? So we are able to plot the frequency of the question in red and the frequency of the comments and answers in blue during those period on a monthly basis. I just want to point it out because we use two different vertical axes, so don't get kind of like confused or delusional that you have some kind of relatively smaller ratio between the questions and the answers that listed in those kind of peak moments. I want to kind of going back, if we see the first peak moment, that was April 2019. And the red represent about 500 questions, but the blue peak that you saw on the top of the slide, that's more than 140,000 comments. And we also kind of pointed why some offline, why we see those peaks across a different time period. And you can see there were mostly associated with the offline kind of event. For example, the major thing that you see is that during April 2019, the Alibaba CEO Jack Ma made a comment saying that you should not, as a worker, you should not complain about 996. You should not complain about overtime because this is a blessing, because you have a very fulfillment job. All those kind of comment. If you want to become an entrepreneur, successful entrepreneur, this is what you need to commit, right? So that really spurs a big reaction on social media discussion. And of course, later you can see that, there was on the job desk and also work kind of organizational, I would call malpractices, because they ask the workers to work during the national holidays. And it also spurs a really heavy discussion on this platform. Next slide, please. And we were able to identify 12 different topics. And there's 4 major topics that you saw on this slide. It's primarily in Chinese, and we translate them in English, and then we also provide a sample comment for your reference. So those are kind of closely related to the discussion about overtime, people's reaction, their sentiment, and the debate between whether this is appropriate and how they deal with the workers' relation. But we want to focus on the next slide, what we find really interesting in terms of the social media discussion. Next slide, please. Yes. So
are you about wrapping up?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Perfect.
Yeah, 30 seconds. So this what we call the marginalized slide, marginalized topic. And what we saw is something that being really censored in or being absent in the everyday kind of conversation. And you see that being present and really prominent on the social media kind of a platform during the debate. So can we move to the concluding mark? I'm sorry. So in order to kind of wrap up this conversation, we just find based on our analysis, we realized that even under the authoritarian regime, that social media can provide a platform for workers to discuss work-related issue. And we see kind of pluralist view, the diverse opinion that being discussed and kind of cascaded during the network. And also, unfortunately, so far, we haven't seen any sign or any strong sign that those discussions can lead to activism or traditional defined activism. Thank you for your time.
That was wonderful. Thank you both. So this is great. We have a little over 15 minutes left for questions for one another and questions from the audience. So I'll kick things off with a question. And while I do that, you can either post questions to the chat and I can try to sort of curate them, or if you want, you can just raise your hand through the system and I can call on you that way. But like I said, I'm going to kick things off. And Jenna, my question is for you, which is kind of a simple one, I think. You talk about developers and who they're responding to. But at the end of the day, don't developers just work for the employer, right? Isn't it just the employer who's paying the bills? And if that's true, then why is it that they would listen to or be concerned about workers much at all?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think that's exactly how the vendor, the technology company itself initially saw things. The interesting backstory around this paper is that this new development team came in about 6 or 9 months before the start of my study, and kind of upended things. And they were user-centered design folks with experience in all sorts of different industries, but not manufacturing specifically. And it just never occurred to them that they would not talk to the machine operators who were using a piece of this platform by interacting with this tablet. They said, of course, that's just the practice of agile software design, of user-centered design. We should go talk to them. And in doing that, they found that there was this intense dislike around some of these particular features. They heard a lot of emotional feedback around the effect that the platform had around the workers' motivations and the way that they kind of related to their managers. And so it became a little bit of a crusade for this development team, I think, to try to fix some of this. They found it kind of to be a personal affront that a technology they were designing was so hated by a key user group of it. But I think more broadly, yes, of course, the developer company itself is dependent on managers to pay the bill, but they realized as they kind of kept moving through this process that they were incredibly dependent on workers as well to accept and to use the technology, because it was very easy for workers to just ignore it and to not enter in complete or accurate data. And they've kind of proceeded to do some study around what they call their customer health scores, to try to predict which of their customers were going to churn. And they started to draw some lines around, okay, it seems to be that the companies where the workers are unhappiest with this technology are the ones that are going to churn and are going to stop, their subscription to our platform. So it did in the end kind of come around to be a financial dependence on workers as well, just in a bit of an indirect way.
Excellent, thank you. Duan Yi has a question for Mike that I see in the chat, but Duan Yi, if you just want to speak it, you can.
Yeah, hi, Mike. Great presentation. And I'm wondering, how is this different from the traditional moonlighting, as we know in the traditional IR literature? So we know that people always often combine short-term employment with a more stable full-time job. So is this phenomena that you just describing any different from the traditional moonlighting?
Thank you, Duan. I think that's an interesting question. It's always a challenge with qualitative research. How is this different from things that have come before? I'll say it in two ways. One is that people's ability to quickly enter platforms and exit them, and somewhat, although not completely, set their own hours allows them to be a little bit more vindictive, I'd say, in the way in which they use platforms against their more traditional employers. Like, it's hard to convey the tone of some of these interviews, but there was some glee when people were saying, I call off work because I can make more money and I don't have to deal with my boss or coworkers. It was almost a sense of empowerment that there was a way that they could get away from a situation that they felt that they were somewhat trapped into. And so I think of more traditional moonlighting may be a way in which you say, I'm either building up money to get away from my employer, or I'm going to just career bridge because I feel like I'm not advancing. But I think that the opportunity to move quickly in and out of platform markets and to have several different ones to choose from makes it slightly different than what we've previously seen.
Another question for you, Mike. Kevin Connor has a question about sort of your sample and really about the population that it's meant to generalize to. In particular, how did it break down by gender? And did you notice any difference in attachment or perceptions that seem to follow along gender lines?
It's right that Instacart is overwhelmingly female. Of the population, there is about 80%. In rideshare, it's basically flipped. It's part of why I enjoyed interviewing Instacart workers, is because it's a gender inversion from the population that I normally work with. I didn't notice any differences in perceptions. It seemed that both that there wasn't a gender effect based on how people used gig work or the ways in which they deployed it. It was more driven by their relationship to their previous job. And if they felt that they were being supported in their previous job, gig work wasn't really seen as a pressure valve or a weapon. Whereas those who had bad experiences with their previous employers tended to see it as an outlet or a bridge to a more satisfying career.
Great. Professor Reardon at Illinois has a question. Go ahead, Christine.
Hey, everyone. It's really nice to see all of you. Thank you so much for your papers. I had one question for Jenna, which was actually very similar to what Adam had mentioned, which was about the conditions in your case which suggest motivation for that relationship, that working between the developer of the platform wanting to account for worker input And based on your answer, it seemed like a potential condition was that there was something about the culture of something about the developer of the tech, right, that was driving that relationship. And I just kind of was hoping to hear if that's kind of the right understanding of your case, or if there are other things that you've been thinking about what motivates that kind of feedback loop, and whether that might come from the employer side as well. And then I also had a question for Duani and Ting Ting, which was about I was thinking about the kind of, standard definition of voice that we think about in IR, input into decisions as Bud defines it, which has embedded within it implications of power and affecting change. And so I've always kind of struggled with how to think about that in relation to more dispersed, decentralized forms of voice like social media. And so I'm wondering what your research suggests about that definition and how you might think about questions of input and power in the particular setting that you're looking at. So thank you all.
Good to see you, Christine. Thanks for the question. I'll take that one first. And it just kind of gives me a chance to expand a little bit more on the answer to Adam, which is I think there is potentially something about the technology company itself. I've talked to a couple people who are familiar with more of the bigger technology companies that we know of that operate on a bit of a larger scale. Some connections that Mike helped me make actually, and heard that I think it was Uber or Lyft had their entire driver-focused user design team laid off during the pandemic. So it's a very low priority for many technology companies to actually try to gather feedback and improve the technology for this lower powered user group. So there's certainly something about the power that subgroup has within the company itself, and whether it can kind of make the case that working on behalf of the lower powered group is strategically important for the company itself. I think there's another boundary condition around the technology itself as well. So if we think about other technologies that are used in the workplace, and think of other monitoring technologies that are not used by workers, but instead are used to monitor workers directly. So we would imagine, of course, that it would be much more difficult to make the case that the workers who are being monitored and maybe disciplined through a technology have some useful feedback to give. It might just be a more difficult sell on all sides. So I think there does have to be some threat of, workers have some power here. They have the ability to not use or to sabotage the technology or to kind of improve its use in the workplace. And so there's a real strategic reason to argue for that. And, lastly, I think that employers, who are employing these workers do have a role to play here in allowing developers to talk to their workers, because they certainly are able to put up roadblocks in a lot of cases if they want to. The machine operators, their time was money. They need to be at the machine. And so if the developer wants to talk to them and that takes them away from their machine, that's a problem. It's difficult to justify on all sides again. So I think there's some complementarities in employers and vendors' approaches, and it kind of requires both of them to actually facilitate workers' feedback being included in that process, unfortunately.
So yeah, I'm gonna jump on to the second question that Christine asked. Thank you for the question. This is the struggle that we've been having. Duani and we have been discussed this for a long time, right? Because in the social movement, social media literature, there's always kind of two lines of debate. One line is this is mobilizing people. This is really raising awareness. This is giving kind of an individual power to build a collective kind of identity and collective conscience, which is the first step for solidarity and organizing, right? And the other line is this is totally just superficial. People just have this spontaneous reaction and it doesn't really lead anywhere. My take on this is social media is here to stay. And no matter you like it or not, it's for the environment. The environment is changing, the context is changing. Maybe we should reconsider how we define organizing result or organizing outcome. Maybe we, given current condition in the US or in China, maybe we don't really go with organizing as the first step. We take multiple steps. We mobilize people first, right? We raise the awareness first. We give them power so they recognize there's a possibility for them to talk about those issues with other folks. right? Like online, and then that could lead to the next steps that we organize in the workplace, right? Because this generation, they don't have a lot of exposure in terms of unionization. So whatever communication and exposure we can give them, like we are moving one step towards like, the actual organizing and the actual goal that has been established. So that's how I react to this question.
Yeah, I think I want to build on that. So I think my take on this is that although we think that the social media enabled voice is powerful, it can give workers a lot of the information power because workers can rank their the labor practice of the employer. So in China, we have the white list, the black list. So workers can share information online. But I still don't think that this can replace the traditional worker organizing efforts. Because in China, during our interview, a lot of workers say, oh, we still want to have a union, but there is no such opportunity. So we think that, yes, in a place without the traditional voice option, social media can be very powerful, but still it cannot give workers associational power that is provided by the traditional worker voice channels.
Great. Duanyi, Ting Ting, keep your ears perked because our PhD student Ning Li has a question, another question for the two of you.
Hi, all the presenters. Thank you for the amazing research. And I have a specific question for Duanyi and Ting Ting, and it's in regard of your methodology part. First, I really appreciate that you guys bring this DHL computational modeling into the IR field. So I was wondering, like, how would you integrate your semi-structured interview parts into the computational modeling parts? So because you guys already show the results and you group in topics, are those topics you use to lead in your interview scripts, or you're using interview to answer the same research question and to compare the results from the two methods part? I know time is limited, but I really want to know more about how you're going to approach this interview part. Yeah.
So this is the discussion we always had, like, do we use the computational result to lead our design of interview or not? And the decision that we made, saying that like we're gonna try to kind of like compartmentalize these two things, right? Like, we really want to know, like, if we compare and contrast these two methodologies, what can we get out of this, right? So based on our current in-progress interview and then our computational topic modeling result, what we find is that really, like, you see more different opinions, different ideas that are being popped up on social media compared to, like, the kind of like limited scale that we conducted the interview. But on the other side, like, we can get a sense that, what are the kind of like a really representative kind of opinions that we can gather through the interview, and maybe the workers provide more kind of in-depth discussion. So that's the part that we try to explore, because there's no kind of like, I would say, standard best practices to see which one is better or how are we going to use it. So right now we just do this exploratory kind of like a methodology comparison to see, hey, how do we make sense of all those methodologies and get the best result that we want to learn.
Yeah, and also, Ning, I think for the question about whether online voice could lead to offline activism, I think that question cannot be answered by looking at social media data alone, because we ask workers about, oh, whether your schedule ever changed after the state regulate to enforce the labor law in China, and surprisingly, we do not see a lot of changes that is happening after the state say, oh, 996 the work schedule is illegal. I think this is surprising. This is not something we anticipated, and this goes back to Christine's question about the power of worker voice online. So of course, we think that worker voice online raise people's awareness, but at the end of the world, I think without the effective trade union, without other voice channels, I think the effectiveness of worker voice online is still limited, because it does not really bring in any the fundamental changes in the organizations.
We have time. I think we can squeeze in one more question, and it's from Professor Aboud at Penn State.
Thank you very much, Adam. I think there was just a response to my question in the chat from Ting Ting, but let me ask the question. I was just curious, when Jack Ma was extolling 996, and you saw that huge spike in comments and reaction. I'm just curious, did you ever break down the content of the reaction? Did you ever decide X percentage of it was negative, X percentage was positive, or were there other variations there that you could report to us about?
Yes, I did a little bit of preliminary sentiment analysis, which is another kind of like computational method. So I didn't really dive into all this 140,000 comments to read which one is positive and which one is negative. But the preliminary answer I can give you is like about more than 90% are actually negative. So especially from like the general kind of like, I would say ordinary citizens, right? You got like a small positive support from all those CEOs, like for example, JD.com or like a WeChat, like a CEO of WeChat. Like they all say, oh yes, that's the entrepreneurial spirit. If you want to become rich, become famous, have a successful business, this is the commitment you have, right? You have to pay your dues. But majority of the ordinary citizen is like, you know, oh, like they were successful. Now they try to justify their successful and then make an excuse for the exploitation that they had towards a worker. So that's kind of like the general impression we got from the data.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Great. So we have come to an end. So on the one hand, I'm sorry for you because I think the highlight of your Lyra may now be behind you. But on the other hand, we had an awesome panel. And so I think for that, we should thank our speakers.
Thank you for Adam organizing this and sharing the session.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everyone.
Cool.
Great. So I hope to see the rest of you at some other sessions.